He ruthlessly kicked his beautiful wife completely out entirely of their massive house, highly arrogantly convinced completely by his highly toxic mother that she had violently betrayed him. Exactly 8 agonizing years completely later, he confidently walks directly into a highly sterile hospital and completely, violently, freezes. There, she officially is, completely with a highly innocent young boy who successfully possesses his exact, highly recognizable piercing eyes. "Is he officially mine?" he violently asks completely with a highly trembling voice. And absolutely everything, the highly toxic lies, the highly malicious, hidden letters, and a highly profound love that absolutely even massive time could absolutely not completely erase, violently comes completely to absolute light. Welcome back, my beautiful family. If you fiercely love highly explosive stories entirely about highly toxic betrayals, massive regrets, and the highly beautiful power entirely of a true second chance, you absolutely must hear this incredible story. Please smash that like button, subscribe to our channel, and let me know exactly what you would do if you found out your mother ruined your marriage in the comments below. Let's get directly into the price of suspicion. Part 1. The toxic betrayal. The heavy air entirely in massive Seville aggressively smelled entirely of highly sharp metal and highly dry dead flowers. The large windows were completely wide open, but the highly suffocating air aggressively remained completely, utterly still. The highly oppressive heat aggressively clung completely to the blank walls, exactly like highly contained, suffocating wrath. Upstairs, the highly elite lawyer, Daniel Torres, paced highly frantically completely through his massive bedroom completely with his sharp jaw violently clenched and a highly lost, highly distant gaze. Entirely, while a highly massive pile, entirely of highly glossy photos, were carelessly, violently scattered completely across the massive bed. Every single highly toxic image was a highly brutal blow. Every single highly heavy silence, a highly muffled, violent scream. I highly explicitly warned you, Sophia. I highly explicitly warned you that I would absolutely never, ever, highly generously tolerate exactly this. His deep voice was exactly like a highly sharp knife, violently dragged completely over hard cement. There were absolutely no massive doubts completely left. The highly pathetic, tiny amount, entirely of pure love, that highly miraculously remained. Exactly, if absolutely, any highly genuinely, completely remained entirely, was completely, violently crushed entirely under massive tons entirely of highly toxic suspicion. Sophia completely stopped perfectly in the heavy threshold, violently trembling, her soft hands completely open entirely at her fragile sides, exactly as if she were highly desperately attempting to miraculously contain a highly violent, internal hurricane. "Daniel." Her beautiful voice was miraculously almost a highly fragile whisper. "Intensely, look directly at me, at the absolute very least actively do exactly that." He absolutely did not actively look entirely at her. He highly aggressively grabbed the highly toxic photos completely with absolute violence, exactly as if exactly that could highly magically actively protect him completely from bravely facing her. The highly toxic images. Sophia peacefully in a highly quiet restaurant. Sophia highly happily smiling perfectly. Next completely to a highly strange man that he absolutely did not completely know. Sophia confidently entering a highly massive building that was absolutely not her highly elite office. They actively seemed to highly loudly say absolutely everything that Daniel highly terrifyingly feared to clearly hear. Do you genuinely, arrogantly think I am an absolute pathetic idiot? He violently threw the highly toxic photos completely onto the small living room table, completely with a highly dry, loud thud. Do you arrogantly think I absolutely do not profoundly know exactly what these highly toxic photos explicitly mean? She confidently approached significantly closer, completely without absolutely any toxic fear entirely of his highly aggressive tone, but completely with a highly profound sadness that absolutely only someone who is completely, utterly exhausted, entirely, from highly pathetically defending completely themselves, can successfully carry. I honestly do not completely know exactly who maliciously took those highly toxic photos, nor exactly where you highly illegally successfully got them completely from. But I absolutely never, ever violently betrayed you, Daniel. Absolutely never. Do you genuinely, arrogantly think you are actively going to highly successfully convince me completely with exactly that? His highly bitter laugh was incredibly cruel. In a highly quiet corner entirely of the massive room, peacefully sitting exactly like a highly cold statue, Mrs. Elena Torres, his highly toxic mother, intensely observed the highly explosive scene. Her piercing eyes were incredibly freezing cold, completely with a highly toxic cynicism flawlessly disguised exactly as highly pathetic compassion. It was officially she who had highly maliciously, highly secretly delivered the highly toxic photos completely to him. It was officially she who, completely with a highly low voice and highly fake, worried eyes, had highly maliciously whispered directly to her successful son, exactly days completely before, I absolutely do not fiercely want highly important people to vividly see you exactly like a highly pathetic fool. Intensely look directly at exactly this, and highly logically draw your absolute own massive conclusions. Sophia smoothly turned completely toward her highly toxic mother-in-law, completely with her beautiful eyes, violently filled completely with hot tears. But her beautiful voice absolutely still fiercely resisted. You profoundly know that exactly this is an absolute, toxic lie. That these highly toxic photos, the highly fake photos, absolutely do not flawlessly prove absolutely anything. Mrs. Elena highly elegantly crossed her expensive legs, smoothly took a highly slow sip, entirely of her highly expensive, exactly now completely cold coffee, completely without absolutely any massive rush. I profoundly know exactly what I vividly saw, and you profoundly know incredibly well exactly what I am actively talking entirely about. Highly pathetically crying absolutely isn't actively going to successfully serve you entirely for absolutely anything exactly now, my highly pathetic dear. Daniel legally possesses the absolute right to explicitly know exactly who he highly foolishly married. Sophia violently shivered exactly as if she had literally just been brutally slapped completely with a highly invisible, lethal hand. She intensely looked directly at Daniel, who highly aggressively clenched his massive fists incredibly tightly, completely, with a highly tense, sharp jaw. He absolutely still completely avoided actively looking directly at her. I absolutely never, ever actively asked you to fiercely choose completely between your highly toxic mother and me, Daniel. But exactly now, I highly desperately ask you to intensely look directly into my beautiful face and highly honestly, explicitly tell me exactly if you genuinely, truly believe entirely in exactly this. There was a highly heavy, suffocating silence, exactly the highly specific kind that absolutely is not completely empty. They are completely full, completely filled entirely with massive pain, entirely with highly toxic pride, entirely with highly massive things that violently hurt way too incredibly much to absolutely ever be explicitly said. Daniel intensely looked completely out the large window. The highly bright orange twilight light beautifully cut the massive buildings entirely of Sevilla exactly like a highly hot, sharp blade. And it was absolutely only exactly then, completely without actively looking entirely at her, that he bravely spoke. "You are actively leaving exactly this massive house exactly today. The entire massive world completely, violently stopped entirely for exactly one highly brief instant. Absolutely even the freezing wind actively seemed to highly respectfully quiet, completely down. Sophia cowardly took exactly one massive step, completely backward. Exactly as if the solid floor were actively, violently sinking completely beneath her weak feet. She frantically searched entirely in his piercing eyes, entirely for absolutely any highly fragile crack, absolutely any highly tiny sign, entirely of the exact, true man she beautifully knew. But there was absolutely only pitch-black darkness. "Do you genuinely, truly, want exactly this?" "I absolutely do not desperately want to aggressively continue highly toxically living, completely with absolutely someone who highly maliciously lies, completely to me, who highly toxically deceives me completely behind my broad back, who highly hypocritically smiles completely at me, completely during the bright day, and violently betrays me completely during the dark night." She incredibly slowly shook her beautiful head. Exactly like absolutely someone who vividly sees absolutely another person violently drowning completely without actively being highly physically capable, entirely of successfully reaching them. Her piercing gaze was exactly now completely dry, but her absolute entire fragile body violently trembled. A highly brief, highly bitter laugh violently escaped completely between her perfectly white teeth. "Do you genuinely, truly believe I would highly possibly, absolutely, be completely capable entirely of exactly that completely with you?" "It absolutely no longer fiercely matters." He aggressively grabbed the expensive pen and violently threw the highly toxic divorce papers completely onto the small table. "Simply actively sign." Sophia absolutely did not actively respond. She confidently walked directly to the comfortable armchair, sat heavily down completely in absolute silence, and highly meticulously read absolutely every single highly toxic line. Her soft fingers violently hesitated exactly when actively taking the heavy pen. For exactly one highly massive moment, Daniel highly genuinely thought she would violently refuse, that she would highly aggressively make a highly public scene, that she would violently scream, but she highly silently signed. The highly sharp sound entirely of the heavy pen, highly aggressively scratching the thick paper, was significantly louder than absolutely any violent scream. Mrs. Elena confidently stood completely up, highly toxically satisfied. The highly pathetic play had completely, permanently finished. Sophia confidently stood completely up, confidently walked directly toward the steep staircase, smoothly picked completely up the cheap suitcase that was absolutely already completely ready, exactly as if she had flawlessly foreseen. Absolutely everything, and completely stopped perfectly in the heavy door. She absolutely did not actively look entirely at her highly toxic mother-in-law. She absolutely did not actively look entirely at the massive living room. Absolutely only directly at Daniel. Her beautiful voice was incredibly low, miraculously almost completely broken, but highly, undeniably firm. Exactly one highly agonizing day, you will profoundly, horrifyingly realize exactly what you highly toxically chose to blindly believe. And she confidently left. The highly heavy door violently closed completely, with a highly dry, loud thud. Exactly like the highly definitive end entirely of a highly tragic chapter that absolutely no one fiercely wanted to actively write. Inside, Daniel remained completely, utterly motionless, intensely staring directly at the heavy wooden door, completely inside. His fragile heart absolutely still violently burned, but there was absolutely something incredibly strange, entirely and exactly that massive fire. Absolutely something that violently hurt, significantly more than the highly toxic rage. Absolutely something that was highly likely the highly terrifying doubt. But he absolutely did not completely know it completely yet. Not completely yet. Daniel kicked his wife out because of his mother's lies. What would you do if your partner's family tried to ruin your relationship? Tell us below. Part 2. The reunion. The highly dark night violently fell completely over massive Sevilla, completely with a highly suffocating, massive weight. And the massive house, exactly now completely without Sophia, physically felt significantly larger. Completely, utterly empty. Exactly as if the highly massive rooms profoundly knew that absolutely something highly essential had violently gone and would absolutely not magically return incredibly soon. Agonizing years significantly later, the highly tragic memory entirely of exactly that highly specific afternoon. Absolutely still highly aggressively repeated, completely in Daniel's highly terrifying dreams, completely with the highly absolute precision entirely of a highly trained nightmare. He absolutely always violently woke completely up, entirely in the highly exact same part. The heavy door violently closing, the cheap suitcase loudly descending the steep steps, the highly sharp sound entirely of the secure deadbolt, and a highly deafening silence that actively seemed to highly permanently inhabit completely inside him. Even exactly today was absolutely just exactly another highly normal day. Exactly one, entirely, of those highly boring days that fiercely promise absolutely nothing and violently end completely up, miraculously changing absolutely everything. Daniel confidently entered the massive Esperanza hospital. He was actively there entirely to highly politely accompany an elite client entirely from his massive law firm who had highly suddenly physically felt incredibly unwell, completely during a highly stressful meeting. He absolutely didn't even completely know the massive hospital, but the highly beautiful name violently resonated completely with him. Esperanza, hope. A highly heavy word he had highly aggressively avoided entirely for a highly incredibly long massive time, while he highly patiently waited entirely in the highly busy lobby. A highly strong aroma entirely of sharp disinfectant flawlessly mixed completely with the highly bittersweet smell entirely of cheap plastic flowers completely filled the heavy air. Innocent children violently cried entirely in absolutely some highly dark corner. The highly exhausted nurses rapidly passed completely by, completely with highly thick folders. And a highly constant low murmur completely permeated the massive place, completely with a highly invisible, toxic tension. Daniel was highly desperately attempting absolutely not to completely violently sink completely into his absolute own highly toxic thoughts exactly when absolutely something or absolutely someone completely violently paralyzed him. She rapidly passed completely by, completely without actively seeing him, completely with a highly official ID badge heavily hanging completely from her delicate neck, a highly thick folder fiercely pressed completely against her fragile chest, and her beautiful hair highly messily tied completely up entirely in a highly rushed, messy bun. Sophia, the entire Buare massive world physically seemed to violently tilt completely to the absolute side. It absolutely wasn't a highly pathetic memory. It absolutely wasn't a highly toxic hallucination. It was officially her. Her highly confident, beautiful walk. Her highly determined gaze completely straight ahead. Her fragile shoulders that heavily carried significantly more than absolutely just the highly exhausting work shift. Daniel violently stood completely up, completely without actively knowing exactly if he absolutely should highly loudly pronounce her beautiful name. Absolutely something massive, entirely inside him violently beat incredibly hard. Her beautiful name violently burned entirely in his dry throat. But he absolutely did not loudly call her. He simply highly quietly followed her. Exactly like absolutely someone highly aggressively dragged completely by a highly invisible, massive thread. She smoothly turned directly to the absolute right, directly toward the highly secure pediatric ward. She confidently entered completely through a heavy door, and it was exactly there, perfectly right, perfectly in front, entirely of exactly that heavy door, that Daniel completely stopped and vividly saw a highly innocent young boy, completely alone, peacefully sitting entirely on a highly tall, hard bench, his incredibly tiny feet happily dangling completely in the heavy air, exactly as if he were highly patiently counting the highly slow seconds. His highly beautiful face incredibly slightly turned, his highly expressive eyebrows beautifully arched entirely in a highly familiar, specific way. The exact same, highly specific type entirely of nose. The highly delicate chin, just a highly tiny bit tilted, nothing. But exactly what completely, violently froze Daniel was his highly piercing gaze. Exactly that highly piercing gaze was exactly like vividly seeing his absolute own self at exactly 8 young years old. The innocent child absolutely also vividly saw him, and highly intensely returned the highly piercing gaze, completely without a single ounce entirely of toxic fear. Exactly as if massive time had completely violently stopped entirely, so that the exactly two entirely of them could highly meticulously study absolutely each other, completely mutually. The highly innocent eyes entirely of the young boy violently narrowed. Exactly as if highly desperately attempting to miraculously fit a highly impossible, complex memory. Daniel physically felt a highly brutal blow completely in his heavy chest. It absolutely could not highly possibly be. Or, absolutely yes, the heavy door smoothly opened. Sophia confidently stepped completely out, completely, with a highly thick medical file entirely in her soft hand, and completely, violently, stopped exactly upon vividly seeing him. Her beautiful eyes violently opened completely wide, her fragile body completely, violently tensed entirely for exactly one highly microscopic second. Absolutely neither, entirely of them, explicitly said absolutely anything. The highly heavy silence entirely of the massive hospital physically seemed to completely absorb absolutely even the highly chaotic sounds, completely all around them. "Daniel," she stated entirely in a highly specific tone that was significantly more massive shock than highly pathetic nostalgia. He rapidly opened his arrogant mouth, but absolutely zero heavy words successfully came completely out. He intensely looked completely back directly at the innocent child, then directly at her. It highly agonizingly cost him a highly massive effort entirely to softly say, "Is he officially my biological son?" His deep voice violently came completely out, incredibly rough, miraculously, almost completely breathless, exactly as if it had absolutely been highly securely locked, completely away, entirely for agonizing years, completely inside a highly secure, locked box. Sophia absolutely did not highly actively respond completely immediately. Her beautiful face violently hardened, exactly as if she were flawlessly putting completely on a highly protective mask. Her piercing eyes, which had exactly once absolutely been incredibly sweet, exactly now possessed absolutely something highly resembling solid steel. Still, they violently trembled. She took a highly massive breath. "Yes, he absolutely is." Daniel heavily rested his massive hand completely on the hard back entirely of a cheap chair. He highly desperately needed to actively hold completely onto absolutely something highly solid. The innocent child absolutely still intensely observed them completely, with a highly pure curiosity that absolutely only highly innocent children successfully possess, and a highly toxic silence that violently hurt significantly more than highly loud screams. "Why exactly, Daniel?" she softly began, but violently interrupted completely herself. She highly desperately wanted to actively ask absolutely everything completely all at once. "Why exactly didn't you absolutely never, ever explicitly tell me? Why exactly did you violently disappear? Because exactly now," Sophia heavily lowered her piercing gaze and bravely spoke completely before he could highly possibly actively ask. "Exactly that absolutely changes nothing, Daniel." The heavy words were incredibly cold. Exactly like absolutely someone who actively builds a highly impenetrable wall completely before the absolute other person, highly aggressively actively attempts to successfully scale it. She confidently took exactly one massive step completely forward, exactly as if to highly definitively effectively end the highly tense conversation. Daniel physically felt a highly tight knot exactly upon clearly hearing the beautiful name. Leo. He rapidly opened his arrogant mouth, but literally could not successfully say absolutely anything. Sophia intensely looked directly at him completely again. There was massive pain entirely in her beautiful eyes, but absolutely also a highly absolute firmness that he had absolutely never, ever vividly seen. She was the exact beautiful woman he intimately knew, and absolutely someone completely, utterly different, completely at the exact same, highly terrifying time. A highly powerful woman who had absolutely been violently forced entirely to miraculously become significantly stronger than she absolutely ever fiercely wanted. He highly desperately needs absolutely some highly complex tests, and I actively possess highly exhausting work to aggressively do, she stated completely with a highly cutting, freezing tone. "Sophia, wait." Daniel aggressively took exactly one massive step. "I absolutely do not completely understand exactly why you absolutely didn't. Not completely right perfectly here," she violently interrupted him. "Absolutely not completely directly in front entirely of him." Her beautiful voice violently came completely out, entirely, in a highly dry, sharp whisper. Her piercing eyes absolutely did not, highly generously permit, absolutely any pathetic reply. Leo absolutely still intensely looked directly at them completely, with a highly deep frown. Highly desperately attempting to profoundly understand exactly what that highly strange man explicitly meant. He had vividly seen it incredibly clearly. But highly innocent children absolutely do not highly logically reason completely with cold logic. They profoundly feel, and entirely in that exact, highly terrifying moment. Daniel vividly saw absolutely something absolutely even significantly more highly devastating. The innocent child blindly trusted her. He completely, blindly trusted her completely, absolutely. And he was officially an absolute, highly pathetic stranger. Can I highly possibly vividly see him completely again? Sophia tightly pressed her soft lips highly thoughtfully. Her fragile heart actively at highly violent war, completely with absolute caution. Then she stated incredibly quietly, "He officially possesses highly severe anemia. We actively return completely on highly anticipated Friday. If you are absolutely still actively here, perhaps." She smoothly turned completely around and confidently walked completely away, completely down the long hallway. Leo intensely looked completely back exactly one absolute final time, and Daniel, entirely for the absolute first time, completely in agonizing years, profoundly felt, completely, violently excluded completely from absolutely something that was biologically his. Absolutely something that biologically carried his pure blood, his highly arrogant name, but absolutely not his highly massive story. He stood perfectly frozen, perfectly there, completely motionless. The highly soft echo entirely of her confident footsteps beautifully fading completely into the massive distance. The beautiful name entirely of Leo, violently swirling completely in his brilliant mind, exactly like a highly loud bell that absolutely would not completely stop actively ringing. And entirely in his heavy chest, a highly massive, absolute emptiness. The highly specific kind, entirely of massive void, that absolutely does not magically heal completely with massive time. Absolutely, only completely, with absolute truths. Daniel just met his son. Do you think he deserves a second chance to be a father? Tell us below. Part 3. The confession and the choice. That exact, highly agonizing night, Daniel absolutely did not safely return completely home. He highly aimlessly drove completely through the highly quiet streets entirely of massive Valencia, completely until the massive city was absolutely just a highly blurry smudge, perfectly behind the heavy windshield. He highly silently parked entirely in a highly elevated spot, completely from exactly where he could vividly see the highly dark roofs, exactly like highly complex pieces, entirely of a massive puzzle, carelessly scattered, completely in the pitch-black darkness. And he highly stubbornly stayed perfectly there, completely, with his massive hands violently trembling, completely on the heavy steering wheel. His brilliant head, completely, utterly, full entirely of a highly terrifying presence that was absolutely no longer, absolutely, just a highly pathetic memory. It was highly real flesh. It was a highly beautiful voice. It was a highly piercing gaze, flawlessly reflected entirely, in that entirely, of a highly innocent child, who flawlessly carried his absolute own, highly handsome face, completely in highly perfect miniature. Massive time absolutely could not turn. But the highly massive questions absolutely did. Why exactly had they absolutely never, ever highly actively searched completely for him? Oh, and exactly that violently hurt, significantly more. They highly desperately searched completely for him, completely after absolutely all. The absolute next, highly bright morning. Daniel absolutely did not confidently go directly to the elite office. He highly urgently called his elite assistant, highly pathetically invented a highly fake excuse, and aggressively headed directly straight, completely, to massive Sevilla. The highly agonizing trip completely down to the highly old, traditional house entirely of his highly toxic parents was a highly painful, massive dive completely into a highly toxic past that he had aggressively avoided entirely for agonizing years. Completely, with absolutely every single highly fast kilometer. He vividly remembered the highly suffocated, violent arguments, the highly violently slammed heavy doors, and the highly tragic day that Sophia completely, permanently disappeared, completely from his massive life, completely, with a highly heavy sentence that exactly now violently sounded miraculously, almost exactly like a highly terrifying prophecy. Exactly one highly agonizing day, you will profoundly, horrifyingly realize exactly what you highly toxically chose to blindly believe. Exactly that highly agonizing day had officially arrived. The highly traditional house entirely of Mrs. Elena visually looked exactly the exact same. The highly boring beige facade, the highly dark old wooden windows, highly cheap, fake artificial flowers perfectly at the highly modest entrance. But exactly now, it actively seemed significantly smaller. Or perhaps it was officially him who absolutely no longer flawlessly fit perfectly there. He aggressively knocked completely on the heavy door exactly twice. Absolutely nothing. He highly aggressively tried the heavy handle. It was completely unlocked. He confidently entered completely without absolutely any polite ceremonies. And the highly toxic smell violently hit him incredibly hard. Highly old, stale perfume, sharp eucalyptus, absolutely something way too incredibly, highly toxically sweet. Absolutely all exactly the exact same. Absolutely all highly suffocating. He loudly called her, but absolutely only a highly hollow echo softly answered. He confidently walked directly to the highly private bedroom entirely of his highly toxic mother. He completely stopped perfectly in front, entirely, of the highly old desk. The highly antique piece entirely of furniture, completely with its highly faded golden handles and highly varnished dark wood. It had absolutely always officially possessed a highly secure lock. He profoundly knew exactly that. And he absolutely also profoundly knew exactly where the highly tiny key officially was. Flawlessly hidden completely behind the highly old mirror. Highly securely taped completely with highly cheap adhesive tape. He highly aggressively opened it completely with violently trembling hands. Securely inside were highly old, useless papers, highly unpaid bills, highly yellowed, highly old letters, a highly cheap silver brooch, and then a highly pristine white envelope explicitly addressed directly to him, completely, with a highly familiar handwriting that he would flawlessly recognize absolutely, even completely, with his piercing eyes tightly closed. Sophia. The highly specific date, perfectly in the highly sharp corner, was exactly 3 agonizing months, completely after the highly brutal divorce. He had absolutely never, ever, vividly seen exactly that highly emotional letter. Absolutely never. Daniel incredibly slowly opened it, exactly as if absolutely something highly lethal could highly explosively detonate. Daniel, I highly desperately write exactly this highly emotional letter completely to you, completely, without profoundly knowing exactly if you will absolutely ever actually read it. I have highly frantically attempted to urgently call you. I have absolutely even highly bravely gone directly to your highly imposing door. But Mrs. Elena highly toxically explicitly told me that you were completely, utterly away. Perhaps you absolutely are. Or perhaps you absolutely do not desperately want to vividly see me. I would highly profoundly understand it, but I highly desperately need to explicitly tell you exactly this. Even exactly if you highly arrogantly, fiercely decide to violently tear exactly this highly emotional letter completely up exactly when you successfully finish it. I absolutely did not highly actively do absolutely anything entirely of exactly what they highly maliciously said. I fiercely swore it completely to you, and I absolutely still fiercely swear it. That there was absolutely zero highly toxic betrayal. That absolutely everything was a highly malicious, lethal trap. I fiercely loved you. I absolutely still fiercely love you. And there is absolutely something highly massive that you desperately need to explicitly know. Even exactly if you highly arrogantly, fiercely decide to violently tear exactly this highly emotional letter completely up exactly when you successfully finish it. I am officially heavily pregnant. Daniel physically felt his heavy stomach completely, violently churn. The highly emotional letter violently fell completely to the hard floor, but he absolutely could not violently fall. No, absolutely not exactly now. He aggressively opened absolutely all the highly locked drawers, absolutely all the highly secure locks, and there were significantly more highly pristine envelopes, absolutely all explicitly addressed directly to him, absolutely each exactly one, completely with highly different specific dates, a highly massive, desperate flow entirely of pure desperation fiercely guarded, highly maliciously censored, highly toxically silenced entirely for agonizing years. It was absolutely true. She had highly desperately attempted. He confidently headed directly to the small kitchen. He highly desperately needed cold water, but the highly toxic, bitter taste entirely of absolute guilt absolutely already violently dried his rough throat. The highly loud sound entirely of the heavy front door, smoothly opening violently, pulled him completely out entirely of his massive trance. Mrs. Elena confidently entered, heavily dragging a highly cheap bag, highly toxically talking entirely to her absolute own self, entirely about the highly heavy traffic. Upon vividly seeing her highly successful son, perfectly there, completely, with the highly pristine envelope securely in his massive hand, she completely, violently froze. And then, entirely for exactly one highly brief second, the highly toxic, fake mask completely, violently fell. You confidently came directly to vividly see your loving mother completely without highly politely warning. Why exactly didn't you highly generously give me exactly these highly emotional letters? The highly massive question was a highly dry, brutal blow. She violently hesitated. She desperately attempted to highly toxically smile. What highly emotional letters? Daniel highly aggressively showed her the highly pristine envelope. The beautiful name entirely of Sophia, explicitly written incredibly clearly, perfectly, on the highly white front. His massive hands violently trembled, but his piercing gaze was significantly firmer than absolutely ever before. Do absolutely not toxically lie. Absolutely not exactly now. Mrs. Elena highly toxically recomposed completely herself, confidently went directly to the highly dirty sink, smoothly took a highly cheap glass, highly slowly filled it completely with cold water, highly casually drank, and then heavily set it completely down. I aggressively did the absolute best, highly massive thing entirely for you. The absolute best. Her toxic voice aggressively rose. Highly maliciously hiding that she officially possessed an innocent child was the absolute best, highly massive thing. She smoothly turned completely, entirely around. There was a highly bitter, toxic shadow entirely in her freezing eyes. That highly pathetic woman would have completely, violently destroyed your entire, massive life. You were completely, utterly blind, entirely. Because completely of her. I actively had to violently open your piercing eyes, and entirely for exactly that, I highly toxically lied. You highly maliciously separated me completely from her. You violently pulled me completely away entirely from my absolute own biological son. Mrs. Elena slowly approached exactly as if highly desperately attempting to highly toxically calm a violently injured animal. Daniel, she was actively going to highly aggressively drag you completely into a highly pathetic life, entirely of massive misery. You were actively entirely about to violently leave absolutely everything completely behind, entirely for her. Your highly elite career, your highly massive future, entirely for a highly pathetic woman who legally possessed absolutely zero highly respectable family. She literally possessed me. The highly violent scream loudly resonated completely through the highly small house. A highly heavy, suffocating silence violently fell completely between the exactly two entirely of them. Daniel's highly ragged breathing was incredibly uneven. Exactly as if absolutely every single, highly absolute truth, violently revealed, violently, highly aggressively, took completely away his heavy air. He intensely looked directly at his highly toxic mother, exactly as if he had absolutely never, ever, truly vividly seen her. You completely, violently destroyed absolutely everything. She frantically attempted to gently take his massive hand. He violently pulled completely away. Get the hell completely out entirely of my absolute way. Daniel, get the hell out. The heavy door violently closed completely behind him. Completely, with a highly ancient, absolute fury. The exact same, highly toxic fury, completely with which agonizing years completely prior, he completely himself had violently thrown Sophia completely out. The highly tragic history was actively, violently, repeating completely itself. But exactly now, he was officially completely on the absolute, other, highly terrifying side. Daniel's mom destroyed his marriage on purpose. What would you do if your family did this to you? Tell us below. Part 4. The Sacrifice and the Hope. He heavily returned directly to massive Valencia, aggressively driving exactly like a highly terrifying man, completely on bright fire. Completely with his piercing eyes violently fixed completely on the highly dark road. His brilliant mind entirely in a highly violent whirlwind, entirely of highly explosive images. The highly emotional letter, the innocent child, the highly terrifying look entirely of Sophia exactly when she explicitly said exactly that. It actively changes absolutely nothing. He confidently arrived completely at his absolute own, massive house exactly like absolutely someone violently invading a completely foreign, highly unfamiliar place. He highly desperately needed to vividly see significantly more, to explicitly know absolutely everything. He frantically rummaged completely through highly old, dusty boxes, highly forgotten, ancient bills. He highly successfully found the highly old, highly outdated landline phone number he actively used entirely in exactly that highly specific time. And then, a highly detailed call history, highly numerous, frantic missed calls, a highly specific number that he absolutely did not vividly recognize when he rapidly dialed it completely on his expensive mobile phone. The beautiful name that magically appeared was exactly like a highly brutal blow, completely in the heavy chest. Sophia, and then, exactly as if absolutely something highly violently screamed completely inside him, Daniel aggressively took his expensive phone and rapidly called. She highly smoothly answered entirely at the absolute third highly tense ring. "Daniel." Her beautiful voice absolutely wasn't entirely of massive surprise. It was incredibly hard. "I actively expected exactly this. I successfully found the highly emotional letters." Highly heavy silence. "My highly toxic mother maliciously lied completely to me. She violently broke absolutely everything. She highly maliciously prevented me completely from profoundly knowing." Sophia absolutely did not actively respond. He aggressively continued. "You highly desperately attempted to explicitly tell me. You highly bravely attempted, and I absolutely did not fiercely want to actively listen." His deep voice violently cracked. Entirely for the absolute first time, he violently cried. On the absolute other highly silent side, the highly soft sound entirely of her ragged breathing. And then a highly heavy sentence that was absolutely not a highly pure forgiveness, but absolutely neither a highly toxic punishment. "Do you profoundly understand exactly now?" Yes. Exactly now he profoundly understood. But profoundly understanding was absolutely only the highly terrifying beginning. Exactly 2 agonizing days significantly later, Daniel was officially completely back, entirely at the massive Esperanza Hospital. Absolutely not completely by highly pathetic chance. Absolutely not completely by highly magical destiny, but completely by highly absolute, terrifying urgency. Sophia had highly urgently called him. Her beautiful voice was incredibly firm, but her piercing eyes, entirely in the highly secure video call, flawlessly showed exactly what her soft mouth absolutely did not explicitly say. Blinding fear. Leo was violently sick. A highly severe infection had aggressively advanced way too incredibly fast. His highly fragile body absolutely did not beautifully respond highly well, completely to highly aggressive antibiotics. And the highly complex blood tests flawlessly revealed a highly terrifying, catastrophic pattern. The highly official diagnosis violently struck exactly like a highly brutal punch. Highly severe aplastic anemia, entirely of the highly rare, complex type. Entirely of the highly terrifying type, entirely in which the fragile body completely, violently, stops actively producing highly healthy blood cells. Entirely of the highly terrifying type that desperately needs a highly compatible donor. Daniel confidently arrived completely at the massive hospital, completely before early dawn, completely without peacefully sleeping. Highly insecure, entirely, of exactly. If he absolutely still legally possessed the absolute right to actively be perfectly there, but completely with a highly unshakable, absolute certainty that he absolutely could not, highly possibly absolutely not, actively be perfectly there. Sophia highly anxiously waited completely for him perfectly at the highly secure entrance entirely of the pediatric area. Completely with her beautiful hair highly messily loose, her piercing eyes highly terrifyingly sunken. Upon vividly seeing him, she absolutely said nothing. There was absolutely no highly emotional hug. There was absolutely no highly toxic reproach, absolutely only a highly slight, completely silent nod. "He is peacefully asleep," she stated incredibly quietly, smoothly guiding Daniel completely through the highly silent, sterile corridor. The highly secure room was incredibly small, but highly impeccably clean. Highly boring beige curtains, a highly simple side table, a highly worn, cheap armchair perfectly next, completely to the sterile bed. Exactly where little Leo peacefully slept completely, with his tiny arm highly securely connected, completely to the highly complex IV line. The highly terrifying pallor entirely of the innocent child, violently hurt entirely in his piercing eyes. Daniel literally could not vividly recognize the highly energetic child who had intensely looked directly at him, completely with highly active distrust, exactly short days, completely prior. That incredibly small, beautiful boy, exactly now visually appeared way too incredibly fragile to heavily carry absolutely any highly toxic judgment. The elite doctor explicitly said that the highly complex transplant absolutely must be incredibly soon. We desperately need absolute compatibility. Daniel absolutely only fiercely nodded. He absolutely did not actively ask exactly what he absolutely already profoundly knew. He absolutely did not highly aggressively make a highly public scene. He simply highly generously offered his strong arm, his thick vein, his highly healthy blood. The highly complex tests were highly efficiently done exactly that exact same massive day, and entirely at the absolute, highly late hour, entirely of the afternoon. The highly official, massive confirmation. Highly perfectly compatible. Sophia absolutely did not violently cry exactly upon clearly hearing it, but her heavy breath violently caught entirely for exactly one highly brief instant, exactly as if absolutely something highly massive completely inside her finally, beautifully lowered its highly strict guard. "Do you desperately want to peacefully stay completely with him? Exactly tonight?" she asked, completely with a highly hoarse voice, heavily leaning completely against the heavy frame entirely of the heavy door. "I desperately want," Daniel softly replied, "that exact night." He sat peacefully perfectly, next completely to the sterile bed, completely with a highly thin, cheap blanket perfectly over his strong legs, and his piercing gaze violently fixed completely on the highly pale face entirely of the innocent child. He absolutely still did not completely know exactly if he could highly safely call him son, completely, without highly illegally invading absolutely something highly sacred, but completely inside him. Exactly that highly coveted place was absolutely already completely, utterly occupied. Sophia peacefully slept entirely in the highly uncomfortable waiting room. Daniel, perfectly there, completely alone, completely wada, with the innocent child, smoothly took his expensive phone. He rapidly opened highly old, forgotten audio files, highly old conversations entirely, to which he absolutely no longer actively responded. He frantically searched exactly around the highly toxic time entirely of the highly brutal divorce. He successfully found a highly old audio entirely from Sophia that he had absolutely never, ever actively listened completely to. It was perfectly there, completely unplayed, explicitly dated exactly 2 agonizing days, completely after his highly toxic departure. He aggressively pressed play. Daniel, I profoundly know that you are absolutely not actively going to intensely listen completely to me, but I highly desperately need to explicitly say it. I fiercely loved you. Your highly toxic mother maliciously lied completely to you, and I highly desperately attempted, I fiercely swear, I highly desperately attempted to miraculously make you vividly see. But exactly now, it absolutely no longer highly strictly depends completely on me. I am completely, utterly exhausted. But I desperately wanted you to explicitly know that exactly what we beautifully had was incredibly real. Even exactly if it highly tragically ended exactly like this. Daniel tightly closed his piercing eyes. Her beautiful voice was a highly brutal blow, a highly massive nostalgia completely drenched entirely in highly agonizing pain. Massive time, highly miraculously returned absolutely. Everything completely to him. Exactly now. Entirely in highly agonizing slow motion. The highly freezing coldness, completely with which he highly toxically doubted. The highly violent screams. The highly brutal divorce, highly arrogantly signed. That absolute entire agonizing time. She had absolutely been actively telling the absolute truth. He rapidly opened the highly extensive gallery entirely of his expensive phone. Frantically searched highly old photos. Beautifully learned to highly astutely, vividly see the highly subtle details. Sophia happily smiling completely with him, entirely in a highly old, romantic restaurant. The highly protective hand completely on her massive belly. Agonizing months completely before the highly tragic end. A highly beautiful photo that he had highly toxically ignored. Exactly now, he vividly saw that she was absolutely already heavily pregnant. The massive world absolutely did not, highly suddenly, miraculously change. It was officially him who had absolutely not profoundly known exactly how to highly correctly look. Daniel finally realizes the truth and regrets everything. Do you think he can ever make up for the 8 years he lost? Tell us below. The sacrifice and the promise. The highly anticipated morning entirely of the highly invasive procedure. The massive hospital actively seemed completely frozen entirely in a highly special, reverent silence. Daniel highly rapidly changed. He highly peacefully lay completely down, entirely on the sterile stretcher. Successfully received highly local anesthesia. The highly complex process would absolutely not be incredibly simple. But he absolutely did not violently hesitate. The highly sharp needle violently penetrated his fragile marrow, aggressively extracting the absolute most highly intimate, massive part entirely of his strong body. And he highly willingly accepted absolutely every single highly agonizing second entirely of massive pain, exactly as a highly necessary part entirely of his highly absolute sentence. In the highly quiet room, perfectly next highly. Door. Sophia highly anxiously waited completely alone. Her fragile shoulders completely dropped. Her piercing eyes violently reddened. Absolutely not entirely because completely of the highly terrifying illness. Completely with exactly that. She highly bravely dealt exactly as a highly fierce mother. But entirely because completely of his highly massive presence. Exactly now, perfectly there. Highly generously giving completely of himself, way too incredibly, highly late, entirely. To magically erase the highly toxic past. Way too incredibly highly early, entirely to highly actively promise a highly bright future. He is actively going to absolutely be perfectly fine, the elite doctor stated. Agonizing hours significantly later, completely with massive time, his highly traumatized body will beautifully react, and he will miraculously get significantly better. Daniel confidently walked completely out entirely of the highly sterile room, incredibly pale, highly physically unstable, but completely with a highly genuine, incredibly sincere, beautiful smile, entirely, for the absolute first time. "Thank you so incredibly much," Sophia whispered incredibly softly. Completely, utterly incapable, entirely of intensely looking directly at him entirely, for highly incredibly long. "I am officially the absolute only one who highly profoundly thanks you entirely for generously letting me actively help." In the highly quiet room, Leo violently woke completely up, intensely looked directly at absolutely both entirely of them, absolutely still highly heavily dazed. "Mom, who exactly is he?" The highly innocent question miraculously came completely without absolutely any toxic resentment, absolutely only highly pure curiosity. Sophia gently took his tiny hand, intensely looked directly at Daniel, exactly as if highly politely asking entirely for absolute permission. He fiercely nodded completely, with a highly almost imperceptible, beautiful gesture. He is officially absolutely someone who highly deeply cares, incredibly much entirely about you, and who is actively perfectly right here, entirely for you. Leo absolutely did not actively respond. He simply tightly closed his tiny eyes, incredibly tired, smoothly turned his pale face directly to exactly one highly quiet side, and Daniel slowly approached incredibly carefully. He highly gently stroked his highly dark hair completely with the highly soft tips entirely of his massive fingers, completely with a highly reverent, absolute respect, exactly as if he were flawlessly made entirely of highly fragile glass, exactly as if he were absolutely, undeniably his. In exactly that highly gentle touch, he profoundly felt absolutely something completely different. It absolutely wasn't highly pathetic remorse or highly toxic guilt. It was a highly specific type, entirely of pure love that violently hurt. A highly critical, massive decision fiercely taken. A highly precious life miraculously saved. And the absolute first, highly fragile steps directly toward a highly brand new, beautiful kind, entirely of true family. The silent promise. The highly anticipated following night. Daniel heavily returned completely home. His highly traumatized body absolutely still physically felt the highly invasive extraction, but the highly massive pain that truly mattered was completely different. He smoothly took his expensive phone and aggressively played the highly emotional audio completely again. Then he rapidly opened a highly secure messaging application and frantically searched entirely for his absolute last, highly toxic conversation completely with Sophia, explicitly dated exactly 3 agonizing years completely ago. A highly pathetic happy birthday completely to which she absolutely never, ever highly actively responded. Exactly now. He frantically wrote completely with violently trembling fingers. "Sophia, I am officially right here. I will absolutely not violently leave completely again." And he gently placed the expensive phone completely to exactly one side. He absolutely did not highly actively expect a highly rapid response. He absolutely did not highly pathetically ask entirely for absolute forgiveness. He absolutely only highly desperately wanted to peacefully stay for the absolute first time. The highly massive pain entirely of the absolute guilt that he had finally, profoundly understood absolutely does not magically disappear. But it beautifully transforms completely into a highly silent, desperate plea, into a highly beautiful gesture, into a highly precious present, highly generously given, completely, with bright blood. Because highly occasionally, pure love absolutely does not magically return exactly as it previously was. It beautifully returns exactly as a highly fragile, massive opportunity. The massive hospital peacefully slept. But absolutely, not absolutely. Everyone highly successfully managed to actively do so. In the highly quiet backyard, exactly where highly few people highly actively passed, completely by, entirely at night, there was a highly old, wooden bench, heavily twisted, completely by massive time. Daniel was peacefully sitting perfectly there, completely with his highly expensive coat, completely open, perfectly over his broad shoulders. His massive hands highly tightly interlaced, and his piercing gaze completely lost entirely in a highly pitch-black darkness that flawlessly offered absolutely zero massive answers. The massive city actively breathed entirely in the highly distant, indifferent distance. The highly bright headlights entirely of the massive cars beautifully cut the highly silent highway. But entirely for him, the absolute entire massive world violently shrank completely down. Entirely to exactly that highly dim light, perfectly over the heavy door, entirely of the highly secure emergency room, and completely to exactly what Sophia absolutely still had absolutely not explicitly said, or completely to exactly what she absolutely no longer fiercely wanted to actively say. He clearly heard highly soft footsteps, completely before vividly seeing her. She absolutely wasn't frantically running. She absolutely wasn't violently hesitating. She simply confidently walked exactly like absolutely someone who profoundly knows she absolutely has to be perfectly there. Even exactly if she absolutely still does not completely know exactly why. Upon vividly seeing him, she absolutely said nothing. She completely stopped exactly one highly short meter, completely away. Completely with her soft arms highly protectively crossed. Her beautiful expression was entirely of massive exhaustion. But there was absolutely zero blinding anger entirely in her piercing eyes. Absolutely only massive exhaustion. Absolutely only highly fierce defense. He highly gently gestured completely with his heavy head, highly politely offering her a highly safe space, perfectly on the wooden bench. She violently hesitated, then sat heavily down, but exactly far enough completely away entirely to highly explicitly make it incredibly clear that it absolutely was not highly intimate intimacy. It was absolutely only a highly massive need entirely to actively listen. I absolutely have not peacefully slept completely since the exact day I vividly saw the exactly two entirely of you, Daniel stated incredibly quietly, completely without absolutely any highly pathetic drama. Since exactly that absolute first piercing look entirely from Leo, there had absolutely never been absolutely anything so incredibly, completely clear. Sophia absolutely did not actively respond. Her highly shallow breathing was incredibly slow, highly heavy. But he aggressively continued. I absolutely do not explicitly say exactly this entirely to highly pathetically ask entirely for absolute forgiveness. I profoundly know it actively changes absolutely nothing. But there absolutely is absolutely something that violently hurts me significantly, more than absolutely anything completely else. It is that I vividly saw exactly what he highly desperately needed, and I vividly saw that it absolutely was not me. She intensely looked completely straight ahead, completely without actively facing him. And absolutely still, you confidently came. Yes. Why exactly? Because I would highly aggressively do absolutely anything entirely for him, and entirely for the exactly two entirely of you, if you highly generously permitted me. She highly unexpectedly let completely out a highly brief, short laugh. There was absolutely zero highly genuine humor entirely in it. Absolutely only pure incredulity. Daniel, you actively had agonizing years entirely to successfully wake completely up. And exactly now, you confidently appear completely after absolutely everything. Highly arrogantly expecting that I highly simply, blindly accept it. He slowly turned his handsome face directly toward her, completely with piercing eyes, completely full, entirely of a highly massive exhaustion that absolutely was not highly physical. I absolutely do not highly arrogantly expect you to highly blindly accept it. Absolutely only that you actively listen. Generously, let me bravely speak exactly now. You have absolutely been actively talking completely alone, entirely for agonizing years. Sophia awkwardly shifted entirely on the wooden bench, highly uncomfortable completely, with the massive weight entirely of his heavy words. But she absolutely did not violently interrupt him. I was incredibly, highly weak. I highly toxically let completely. Myself highly toxically actively get completely, violently carried completely away entirely by blinding anger, by highly toxic pride, by my highly toxic mother. And exactly that is absolutely not a highly valid excuse. It is pure, absolute, simple cowardice. I highly arrogantly chose to blindly believe exactly what highly successfully prevented me completely from actively thinking. It was significantly easier to highly toxically blame you than highly courageously admit that perhaps the highly catastrophic mistake was officially mine. She highly protectively hugged completely herself, exactly as if she highly desperately needed to fiercely protect completely herself. Did you highly blindly trust me exactly enough entirely to highly urgently call me completely for Leo? The deep voice entirely of Daniel violently cracked, but he aggressively continued. And I absolutely cannot highly pathetically pretend that exactly that explicitly means absolutely nothing. Because absolutely, even completely with absolutely everything, they highly maliciously did, completely to you. Completely, with absolutely everything, I violently did. You absolutely, still highly generously let a highly massive part, entirely of me, actively be incredibly close, completely to him. Exactly that explicitly says significantly, more than absolutely any highly pathetic, I am incredibly sorry. I confidently came entirely for him, she stated, intensely looking directly at him entirely for the absolute first time. And exactly when, absolutely all entirely of this miraculously passes, I will actively leave completely again. There was highly heavy silence, the highly specific kind that violently hurts. Daniel heavily lowered his massive head, his beautiful voice significantly lower than absolutely ever before. Then, Generously let me actively do exactly this completely right. Generously let me flawlessly show you that exactly if I had profoundly known the absolute truth, I would absolutely have permanently stayed. Generously let me flawlessly show you that exactly if I had profoundly known he actively existed, I would absolutely have highly aggressively done absolutely everything. Completely, utterly different. That I absolutely would not have violently let completely go entirely of your soft hand. Sophia remained completely, utterly silent, entirely for so incredibly long, that he highly genuinely thought she would confidently stand completely up and safely leave. But exactly that absolutely was not exactly what she actively did. What exactly do you fiercely want to flawlessly demonstrate completely to me? Exactly. Her beautiful voice was exactly now significantly sharper. That you are officially a highly good, true father. A highly good, true man. That you highly profoundly regret it? Absolutely all entirely of exactly that. Absolutely does not actively work exactly like exactly that, Daniel. You can highly profoundly feel it. But exactly that absolutely does not magically erase exactly what violently happened. It absolutely does not magically erase exactly how you highly cruelly made me physically feel. The agonizing days I highly desperately attempted to actively contact you entirely, while you highly toxically ignored me. It absolutely does not magically erase the highly agonizing months entirely of blinding fear, fiercely raising an innocent child completely alone, nor the highly terrifying nights pathetically pretending to absolutely be perfectly fine, entirely because I absolutely no longer successfully possessed absolutely anyone completely left. Absolutely nothing. Entirely. Of exactly that magically disappears entirely, because exactly now, you desperately want to actively do it completely right. I profoundly know that it absolutely does not magically disappear, he softly replied completely, with a highly tight knot completely in his dry throat. But I absolutely still remain perfectly here, and I will absolutely not violently leave. She tightly closed her beautiful eyes. For exactly one highly brief second, her highly impenetrable armor completely cracked. But she highly immediately flawlessly recomposed completely herself. You explicitly say exactly that exactly now. Exactly when he highly desperately needs you. Exactly when the massive guilt violently weighs heavily completely on you. And completely afterward. Exactly when he miraculously gets significantly better. Exactly when your highly massive life safely returns directly to highly boring normality. Do you genuinely, arrogantly think I absolutely do not profoundly know exactly what highly specific kind entirely of man you truly are? You absolutely no longer completely know exactly who I truly am. You absolutely no longer highly do. The highly heavy phrase was explicitly said completely with highly freezing coldness, but completely without highly toxic hatred. Absolutely only absolute truth. Then, highly successfully get to profoundly know me completely again, he stated. Generously give me exactly that highly fragile opportunity. Even exactly if it is absolutely only entirely, so that you can violently hate me entirely, for a highly good, valid reason. And absolutely not entirely, for the highly fake version that my highly toxic mother highly maliciously sold completely to you. She intensely looked completely down entirely at the hard ground, completely with a highly deep frown. There was an absolute, highly massive war actively raging entirely in her piercing eyes. and he profoundly knew it. Because entirely for agonizing years, he had highly pathetically pretended that exactly that highly massive war absolutely did not actively exist. Exactly now, he vividly saw her. Daniel, I absolutely am not highly actively asking you to safely return, nor to highly pathetically pretend to have completely forgiven me. Simply highly generously let massive time actively do exactly what I absolutely could not actively successfully listen completely to you. The highly heavy silence was exactly now significantly lighter. Significantly less incredibly heavy. Sophia intensely looked directly at him finally, and absolutely something highly massive entirely in her beautiful eyes was completely different. It absolutely wasn't absolute surrender. It was highly massive doubt. But it absolutely wasn't highly absolute rejection. He fiercely loves highly sweet strawberry ice cream, and he violently hates highly disgusting beets. Me completely too, Daniel softly replied, completely without actively smiling. He officially possesses highly blinding fear entirely of peacefully sleeping completely in the pitch-black darkness. Me completely too. She incredibly slowly released the heavy air. Her soft hand highly gently rested perfectly on her fragile lap, violently trembling. He slowly reached completely out his massive hand, but absolutely not entirely to highly actively touch her. Absolutely only entirely to flawlessly show that he was perfectly, completely there. And that he absolutely would no longer highly cowardly hide. Sophia absolutely did not gently take it. But she absolutely also did not violently pull completely away. And perhaps exactly that, entirely for exactly right now, was completely, utterly enough. A highly fragile, beautiful truce, flawlessly built completely on absolute honesty and the highly pure love entirely of an innocent child. Daniel and Sophia are trying to build trust again. Do you think their broken past can truly heal? Tell us your predictions below. The final epilogue. The silent promise. Exactly 2 agonizing days significantly later. Sophia highly reluctantly accepted the highly fragile invitation. She absolutely did not highly explicitly say it completely with heavy words. She absolutely did not highly officially confirm it completely by text message. She simply highly quietly actively let Daniel explicitly know exactly where they would absolutely be. She highly securely sent him the highly specific location entirely of the highly massive Retiro Park, completely with a highly dry, short phrase. If you fiercely want, confidently come. It was the absolute, highly massive maximum she could highly possibly generously offer entirely in exactly that highly specific moment. And Daniel profoundly understood it. He absolutely did not highly aggressively insist. He absolutely did not highly toxically demand. He simply confidently went. He confidently arrived incredibly early, completely with exactly 2 highly simple bags, entirely in his massive hands. Exactly 1 completely filled entirely with highly fresh fruit. The absolute other completely with a highly old, meticulously folded paper airplane. He confidently walked directly to the highly specific place, highly accurately indicated, completely on the massive map. Perfectly near the highly beautiful lake. Exactly where the highly ancient trees generously provided highly cool shade, completely to the soft ground. And highly happy families happily passed completely by completely, with highly energetic children and highly colorful bicycles. Exactly there they officially were. Sophia peacefully sitting entirely on a wooden bench, completely with her soft arms highly protectively crossed perfectly over her soft lap, and Leo confidently standing perfectly up, intensely watching the highly active ducks. The innocent child vividly saw him absolutely first. He enthusiastically ran directly toward him, absolutely still, completely without happily calling him Dad, but completely without highly active distrust. It was highly pure curiosity, flawlessly mixed completely with a highly incipient, growing affection. Daniel smoothly knelt completely down. I lovingly brought you absolutely something highly special. He highly gently handed him the highly simple paper airplane. Leo highly curiously turned it completely around entirely in his tiny hands. Highly curious. And then, enthusiastically, threw it. The highly simple paper highly clumsily flew and heavily fell, exactly a highly few short meters completely away. But the innocent child laughed loudly, exactly as if it had highly successfully crossed the absolute entire massive sky. Sophia absolutely also beautifully laughed completely without actively wanting to. Daniel highly astutely noticed. And exactly that violently hurt him entirely in a highly beautiful, good way. Exactly like absolutely something highly massive, miraculously returning completely after actively having absolutely been completely, utterly outside the highly fragile body, entirely for a highly incredibly long, massive time. Thank you so incredibly much entirely for confidently coming, she stated. Exactly, just exactly as he safely sat perfectly right, perfectly next, completely to her. Absolutely still, highly respectfully maintaining a highly safe, massive distance, completely between the exactly two entirely of them. I absolutely did not completely know exactly if you would confidently come. I highly explicitly stated that I absolutely would not frantically run completely away entirely again. Leo was exactly now enthusiastically running perfectly behind the highly simple airplane, meticulously unfolding the highly complex folds, and actively attempting highly brand new, highly exciting launches. Daniel intensely observed him incredibly, highly intensely. Every single highly tiny movement, every single highly beautiful expression, actively seemed to completely, utterly absorb absolutely everything. Exactly as if he highly desperately wanted to miraculously recover the highly agonizing lost years completely in absolute silence. He is highly miraculously guiding completely himself, Daniel murmured incredibly softly. I highly genuinely think I had absolutely never, ever, truly vividly seen him exactly like exactly this. No, highly truly. Sophia aggressively crossed her soft arms completely, with her piercing eyes violently fixed completely on the innocent child. He was entirely and highly absolute, heavy silence, entirely for a highly incredibly long, massive time, completely after the absolute first, highly terrifying collapse. He absolutely did not actively eat, nor happily play. He peacefully slept incredibly little. Highly occasionally, he violently woke completely up, highly explicitly, saying that he actively possessed highly terrifying fear entirely of massive death, entirely of completely disappearing. He was exactly 7 young years old. Can you highly possibly even imagine it? No, I absolutely couldn't highly possibly completely either, entirely in exactly that highly specific moment. I simply highly desperately did exactly what I highly possibly could. But there were highly terrifying nights, entirely, in which I absolutely only violently cried, exactly when he was peacefully asleep, and highly desperately prayed entirely for absolutely someone to intensely listen completely to me. I absolutely did not intensely listen completely to you, Daniel stated entirely in a highly low tone, that absolutely did not highly pathetically ask entirely for absolute forgiveness. It simply highly accurately recognized the highly tragic absence. She intensely looked directly at him, and entirely for the absolute first time. There was significantly less massive pain entirely in her piercing eyes. There was absolutely still a highly visible scar, but significantly less entirely of a highly gaping, open wound. There is absolutely something highly massive that I highly fiercely guarded entirely for you, he stated, smoothly pulling a highly thick envelope completely out entirely of his simple bag. It was a highly thick, massive package entirely of highly yellowed, heavily folded papers. Absolutely, some highly visibly stained. I successfully found exactly this, completely among the highly personal things entirely of my highly toxic mother. I absolutely did not highly actively possess the absolute courage entirely to bravely open them completely before. I absolutely did not completely know exactly what to successfully do completely with them. But they are officially yours. Sophia violently hesitated. She highly carefully took them. Slowly read the absolute first exactly one, completely without absolutely any massive rush. Her highly familiar handwriting, her highly agonizing time. Daniel, I honestly do not completely know exactly if you will absolutely ever actually read exactly this. But the highly heavy silence is actively, violently suffocating me. And you are absolutely still the absolute only exact man who could highly possibly miraculously make me successfully breathe. She literally could not successfully continue. She rapidly passed completely from highly emotional letter directly to highly emotional letter. Highly fragmented, beautiful fragments entirely of a highly toxic past that had violently screamed entirely to absolutely be intensely heard. Absolutely, some were highly visibly stained, completely, with highly runny ink. Perhaps completely from hot tears. Completely others visually appeared highly hastily written entirely in exactly one single, highly desperate breath. I highly genuinely thought exactly those highly heavy words had completely, permanently died. That absolutely no one would absolutely ever actually read them. I highly agonizingly read absolutely all entirely of them completely last night. And it violently hurt me entirely because they were 100% absolutely right. Because I absolutely should have intensely listened completely to you. Because I profoundly knew that you absolutely did not highly maliciously lie. And absolutely even so, I highly arrogantly chose to blindly believe exactly what was significantly more highly comfortable entirely for me. You highly violently suffered. Yes, but absolutely not exactly like you. My highly massive pain was absolute, tragic absence. You highly violently lived the absolute, true, massive weight. You fiercely raised an innocent son, completely without me. You highly bravely faced absolutely everything, completely alone. And absolutely even so, you confidently came exactly when he highly desperately needed me. Sophia highly smoothly put the highly emotional letters completely back, entirely into the simple bag. She intensely looked completely back directly at Leo, exactly now peacefully sitting entirely on the hard ground, meticulously disassembling the highly simple airplane entirely to highly desperately attempt to successfully assemble it significantly better. It was exactly as if absolutely nothing, perfectly there, was completely, violently broken. Exactly as if he had absolutely already, highly miraculously accepted exactly what the exactly. Two entirely of them were absolutely, still highly actively learning to miraculously digest. He highly specifically asked me exactly if you were genuinely, truly, his true dad. What exactly did you explicitly tell him? That absolutely yes, and that perhaps he could highly possibly miraculously discover completely for his absolute own self exactly who you truly are, highly completely beyond exactly that, and exactly what you highly, desperately hope he successfully discovers. She intensely looked directly at Daniel. The highly golden, beautiful afternoon light beautifully filtered completely through his dark hair, beautifully giving him exactly that highly soft, familiar glow she vividly remembered completely from entirely before. Exactly when he confidently entered the massive room. Exactly when he sat, heavily entirely on the absolute edge, entirely of the massive bed. Exactly when he fiercely swore that they could absolutely still be perfectly fine. I highly genuinely hope he successfully discovers exactly if you can absolutely be highly blindly trusted. That you profoundly know completely, without me highly actively having entirely to explicitly say it. Exactly if he can highly confidently count completely on you, exactly when he actively possesses a highly terrifying fever, when he violently cries, when he highly catastrophically makes a massive mistake. I desperately want to actively be absolutely all entirely of exactly that. I absolutely also highly desperately wanted highly many massive things, Daniel. They peacefully stayed completely in highly comfortable silence. The highly soft sound entirely of the busy park, beautifully filling the highly tense space perfectly between them. Innocent children loudly laughing. Highly happy couples softly talking entirely in highly low voices. A highly happy dog loudly barking entirely in the highly distant distance. It was exactly as if the entire massive world had miraculously slowed completely down, generously permitting them to successfully breathe completely together, completely, after so incredibly much highly agonizing asphyxiation. That exact night, Sophia highly surprisingly accepted to peacefully have massive dinner entirely in his massive apartment. It absolutely wasn't a highly massive gesture entirely of highly emotional reunion. Absolutely only the highly simple practicality entirely of absolutely not actively having entirely to highly exhaustedly return incredibly early. Since little Leo would absolutely still be highly actively entirely under highly strict medical observation the absolute next bright morning. But exactly, even exactly, although it was absolutely something highly simple, Daniel profoundly understood its highly massive meaning. He sat heavily completely at the small table. Leo peacefully slept heavily wrapped entirely in a highly soft blanket completely on the comfortable sofa. The highly cheap television actively turned completely on, entirely at the absolute lowest, highly possible volume. The massive apartment was incredibly clean, but highly impersonal. Exactly like absolutely someone who highly actively inhabits, but absolutely does not truly belong. She highly astutely noticed it. Daniel, highly pathetically pretend that he absolutely is not actively going to violently wake completely up, completely with a highly painful backache, she smoothly commented, gently pointing directly at the small sofa. I highly seriously thought entirely about highly generously offering you my massive room. but I highly accurately supposed that you would highly fiercely prefer entirely to actively be incredibly close completely to the massive living room. You highly accurately supposed perfectly well. They peacefully ate completely in absolute silence, entirely for exactly a few highly short minutes. The highly simple dish was incredibly simple. Highly delicious pasta completely with expensive olive oil, highly fresh garlic, and highly aromatic herbs, but incredibly hot and highly silently, incredibly respectful. Daniel highly patiently let massive time flawlessly guide. It was officially he who actively broke the highly tense silence. Were you actively completely with absolutely anyone completely during exactly this highly massive time? She violently paused, highly calmly chewed, meticulously wiped her beautiful lips completely with the highly clean napkin, completely before softly responding. I highly desperately attempted, but I absolutely always profoundly felt exactly like I was actively leaving absolutely someone, highly desperately waiting completely for me. Exactly as if a highly massive part entirely of me was absolutely still highly tightly tied, completely to absolutely something completely unfinished. Exactly as if every single, highly brand new person highly violently reminded me that there was absolutely something I had absolutely not, completely, permanently buried. Even completely after absolutely everything? He nodded fiercely completely with his piercing eyes, violently fixed completely on his highly simple plate. Fiercely loving absolutely another beautiful woman, Daniel, he stated miraculously almost entirely in a highly fragile whisper. I absolutely never, ever successfully could. I absolutely always highly toxically compared. It absolutely always violently hurt. She took a massive, incredibly deep breath. The highly massive weight entirely of exactly that highly heavy phrase absolutely wasn't highly romantically romantic. It was incredibly honest, highly real, incredibly raw. I absolutely did not desperately want exactly this to absolutely be a highly tragic, sad story, he murmured softly. And it absolutely does not highly desperately have entirely to absolutely be exactly one. I honestly do not completely know exactly if it can absolutely still be highly miraculously transformed. He rapidly looked completely up. There was absolutely something highly massive entirely in her beautiful eyes. It absolutely wasn't massive rush. It absolutely wasn't highly toxic insistence. Absolutely only a highly silent, desperate plea entirely to be successfully seen exactly as absolutely someone who profoundly learned. Even exactly if it was incredibly, catastrophically late. We absolutely only successfully write exactly what violently comes completely next. The absolute beginning has absolutely already completely passed, and highly miraculously, it absolutely still remains perfectly here. The highly heavy silence that violently followed absolutely wasn't highly uncomfortable. It was exactly as if absolutely both profoundly knew that exactly that highly specific night absolutely did not highly toxically demand highly massive decisions or highly toxic promises. Absolutely, only absolute presence. And highly occasionally, absolute presence is the absolute first, highly massive act entirely of highly real, true love. A highly profound, deep conversation and the highly fragile seeds entirely of a highly beautiful, brand new beginning. Daniel and Sophia are slowly rebuilding their bond. Do you think their broken past can truly heal? Share your hopes and emotions in the comments. Epilogue. A silent hour. The highly beautiful following weeks were absolutely not exactly like a highly romantic, fake movie. There were absolutely zero highly expensive flowers perfectly at the heavy door. Absolutely zero highly dramatic declarations entirely in highly romantic cafes, completely under the highly freezing rain. There was absolute, pure silence. And exactly one highly careful step perfectly directly behind the absolute other. There was little Leo happily smiling completely again, significantly more highly frequently. Daniel highly happily safely picking him completely up, entirely from the highly busy school, exactly whenever he highly successfully could. Sophia intensely observing completely from the highly safe distance, completely with the highly meticulous care, entirely of absolutely someone fiercely protecting a highly fragile, absolutely still highly exposed open wound, even exactly although it was actively, miraculously healing. Daniel absolutely did not highly aggressively force his highly imposing presence. He simply, highly peacefully, was. He happily brought a highly delicious sandwich entirely for Leo's short break, completely without highly politely asking exactly if he highly successfully could. He gently gave them a highly soft goodnight, absolutely even exactly if she absolutely did not actively respond, highly occasionally. He peacefully sat entirely on the highly uncomfortable hospital sofa. Absolutely. Only entirely to intensely listen, completely to their beautiful voices. It was the highly absolute silence that had exactly once absolutely been highly tragically absent, entirely, in his highly toxic absence. But highly miraculous reconstruction absolutely also officially possesses its highly strict limits. And Sophia, entirely, despite absolutely everything, absolutely still fiercely maintained her absolute entire, fragile being completely under the highly impenetrable armor entirely of the highly toxic past. That highly sunny afternoon, exactly while Daniel happily washed the highly dirty dishes entirely of a highly improvised, simple lunch, she confidently entered the highly clean kitchen. She intensely observed him completely in absolute silence. The highly rolled-up sleeves entirely of his simple shirt, completely up directly to his strong elbows. His highly simple, highly efficient movements. The highly absolute silence that highly arrogantly demanded absolutely nothing. He smoothly turned completely around and beautifully smiled. She absolutely did not beautifully return the highly genuine smile. We desperately need to actively talk. He aggressively dried his highly wet hands completely with the highly clean cloth. His highly handsome expression violently became incredibly serious. About exactly what? About exactly what you fiercely want completely from me, completely from us. I absolutely do not fiercely want a highly pathetic US exactly if it is absolutely only actively going to absolutely be a highly pathetic memory. I absolutely do not desperately want to safely return. I fiercely want a highly beautiful beginning, he stated firmly. She incredibly slowly shook her beautiful head. You explicitly say exactly that, exactly, now. But massive time absolutely does not magically turn completely back. Daniel and Leo, he absolutely cannot violently suffer completely again. I absolutely cannot highly dangerously risk exactly that. Can you fiercely love me exactly today, and exactly tomorrow? Daniel confidently approached significantly closer. Absolutely not highly rapidly, absolutely not highly dramatically, incredibly calmly, Exactly like absolutely someone who highly profoundly respects the highly massive pain entirely of the highly fragile person they successfully possess, perfectly directly in front, entirely of them. Tomorrow I honestly do not completely know. But exactly today, I am absolutely right here. And exactly tomorrow, I will highly actively choose to absolutely be completely here, completely again. And the highly anticipated day, completely after exactly tomorrow, absolutely also. Absolutely not entirely out of highly toxic obligation, but entirely because absolutely every single beautiful day that I peacefully spend incredibly close, completely to him, and incredibly close, completely to you, beautifully reminds me entirely of exactly what I violently lost, and exactly what I can absolutely still miraculously build. Exactly if you highly generously permit me. She absolutely did not cowardly step completely backward, but she absolutely also did not highly submissively yield. She simply tightly closed her beautiful eyes entirely for exactly one highly brief instant, exactly as if highly desperately searching entirely for heavy air. You explicitly say exactly that, exactly as if it were incredibly simple. It absolutely is not. Then exactly why does it physically seem so incredibly highly light entirely for you? Because I absolutely already highly agonizingly lived the absolute worst, and I horrifyingly discovered that the absolute worst absolutely wasn't violently losing you. It was absolutely not actively listening completely to you, absolutely never, ever reading your highly emotional letters, absolutely not actively having little Leo securely in my strong arms exactly when he was miraculously born. The absolute worst was profoundly knowing that absolutely all entirely of exactly that could highly possibly have absolutely been completely different, and that it was completely 100% my absolute fault. Highly agonizingly carrying exactly that is absolutely not highly light. But actively being completely here is the absolute only massive thing that actively makes the massive crushing weight highly miraculously bearable. She intensely looked directly at him entirely, in a highly specific way that flawlessly mixed blinding fear and highly pure tenderness. The exact same, highly beautiful expression entirely of absolutely someone who vividly sees the freezing rain violently coming and highly desperately wants to peacefully stay, but is completely, blindly terrified entirely of highly violently getting completely wet completely again. And exactly if I explicitly tell you that I absolutely cannot blindly believe you completely anymore, I will absolutely not highly aggressively attempt to miraculously convince you. I will simply absolutely be. I will intensely listen completely to you. I will highly generously give you massive time. He confidently approached exactly a highly tiny bit, significantly closer. He absolutely did not actively touch her. He simply highly gently extended his strong hand, a highly simple, beautiful gesture, completely without absolutely any highly toxic demand. She violently hesitated. She intensely looked directly at his massive hand, intensely looked directly at him, intensely looked directly at the hard floor, and entirely for the absolute first time. She absolutely did not violently withdraw. She highly generously let her absolute own, violently trembling soft hand miraculously find absolutely his. The highly gentle contact was incredibly light, but completely, utterly enough. Daniel softly, beautifully, squeezed it. She absolutely did not violently pull completely away. I absolutely do not highly toxically promise the entire massive world, Sophia. But I fiercely promise to intensely listen completely to you. And if exactly one highly agonizing day you confidently leave, it will absolutely be entirely because you highly actively decided it. Absolutely never, ever, completely again entirely, because I highly cowardly closed my piercing eyes. She heavily lowered her piercing gaze. A highly single, hot tear beautifully fell completely silently, completely without highly any warning. He absolutely did not highly aggressively dry it. He explicitly said absolutely nothing. He simply remained perfectly standing, perfectly there, fiercely holding her soft hand completely, with the highly exact, absolute firmness, entirely of absolutely. Someone who profoundly knows that true love absolutely is not highly aggressively conquered. It is meticulously, beautifully cared for, and exactly if I absolutely cannot completely forgive, I will absolutely not highly toxically ask you entirely for exactly that. Absolutely only that. Exactly one highly beautiful day, you highly successfully managed to peacefully live completely without exactly this, violently hurting you so incredibly, massively much. She profoundly felt him. Absolutely still highly perfectly, in absolute silence. And absolutely something entirely. In exactly that highly beautiful gesture, absolutely wasn't a highly definitive yes. But it absolutely also wasn't a highly definitive no. It was absolutely only pure presence. And exactly as he had absolutely previously explicitly stated. Highly occasionally exactly that is completely, utterly enough. That exact night she peacefully stayed. She absolutely did not peacefully sleep entirely in her absolute own massive room. She peacefully slept completely with Leo, exactly as entirely, in the absolute most highly difficult, agonizing days. But she highly generously let Daniel happily read a highly entertaining story, completely before the innocent child peacefully fell deeply asleep. He sat heavily entirely on the absolute edge, entirely of the massive bed. Intensely listening to his deep voice violently tremble completely at absolute first, then incredibly firm, then completely, beautifully surrendered. "Daddy!" Leo whispered incredibly softly, entirely at the absolute sleepy end. Daniel completely, violently, stopped. His massive heart violently beat incredibly hard. Sophia intensely looked directly at him, and explicitly said absolutely nothing. But she violently bit her soft lip entirely, to aggressively contain absolutely something she honestly did not completely know, exactly if it was massive pain or pure relief. "I am perfectly here, my beautiful son," Daniel softly replied. It was the absolute first time he clearly heard exactly that highly heavy word. And it actively seemed that finally, absolute life highly generously gave him absolute permission entirely to fiercely deserve it. Sophia confidently walked completely out entirely of the massive room, completely without explicitly saying significantly more. She confidently went directly to the small living room, sat heavily entirely on the cheap sofa, actively turned completely on the absolute dimmest, softest light. Daniel confidently arrived exactly a few short minutes, significantly later. "Did you clearly hear him?" "Yes." He highly actively chose to happily call me exactly that. He blindly trusted. She rapidly averted her piercing gaze. There was absolutely no highly impenetrable armor completely anymore. Absolutely only a highly beautiful woman, who highly agonizingly carried way too incredibly much massive pain, and who exactly now vividly saw pure hope entirely on the absolute other side. Tomorrow is actively going to violently hurt, she stated, because tomorrow it will highly terrifyingly feel exactly as if absolutely everything could highly possibly completely end entirely all over again. And exactly if it violently ends, it absolutely will not be your highly pathetic fault. But I will absolutely be perfectly here, entirely, for exactly as incredibly long exactly as you highly generously permit me. She softly rested her beautiful head perfectly on his broad shoulder. It absolutely wasn't a highly massive, brand new beginning. It was absolutely only a highly peaceful rest, a highly brief interval, exactly 1 quiet hour, and entirely in exactly that highly magical instant. Exactly that was completely, utterly enough. The massive sky completely outside was absolutely already aggressively beginning to beautifully change. A highly muted, soft blue tone flawlessly appeared perfectly on the massive horizon, incredibly slowly, aggressively pushing the dark night completely out entirely of the highly quiet room. Daniel highly gently adjusted the soft pillow perfectly under the tiny head entirely of Leo, and lovingly laid him incredibly softly. Then he confidently stood completely up, incredibly slowly, actively stretching his strong legs. Sophia absolutely also confidently stood completely up, confidently walked directly toward him. They intensely looked directly at absolutely each other completely, without absolutely any massive rush. Exactly like absolutely someone who is absolutely still highly cautiously testing the highly fragile ground. He highly gently stroked her beautiful face. A highly familiar, beautiful face he intimately knew and highly incredibly was actively, beautifully learning completely all over again. She absolutely said nothing, but she absolutely did not violently pull completely away, and entirely, in exactly that highly magical instant, completely under the highly almost bright light entirely of the brand new day, the exactly 3 entirely of them, finally, beautifully, belonged completely to the exact same highly perfect place, completely without absolutely any massive rush, completely without highly toxic demands, simply, beautifully, together.